Hello, Avila Advantage students. We are now 6 weeks done with the course. We only have 2 weeks left, so just keep plugging along. We're in mid-March here, so as I pointed out in an announcement, the Federal Reserve did decide to raise interest rates 25 basis points. So when you think of a basis point, think of it as like 1/100th of a percent. So if the Fed does go from like 1% to 1.25%, that is 25 basis points. And this week in your forum discussion, since we focus on the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, I'm going to have you read an article from 10 magazine by Esther George, our local Federal Reserve president, and interesting discussion on banking, how banking has changed and interest rates, and it ties into monetary policy. So I think you'll find the article interesting, and then I want you to make a forum post about what you found interesting in the article, and also a prediction when you think the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates again. So as we tie this into monetary policy this week, and aggregate demand, aggregate supply, obviously the economy is growing, which is a great thing, but there is also a concern to keep inflation in check. So that aggregate demand curve keeps shifting out. Well, the Federal Reserve was going to put the brakes on a little bit to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of control. And I think the recent numbers for inflation are around like 2.1% at an annual rate. And as long as our wages are going up at that rate, we are doing okay. If our wages aren't going up relative to that rate, we're worse off. And that's the concern. And that the Federal Reserve is trying to balance all those things with GDP, unemployment, and inflation. Okay. With the Federal Reserve itself, the first chapter, you have chapter 28, is going to talk about the 12 districts. We actually have 2 districts in Missouri, the Kansas City and St. Louis. Kansas City kind of serves the western part of the country, and most of the districts were located on the East Coast just because that's when our country developed, and the Federal Reserve was started back in 1914. Most of the population was on the East Coast. So with the policy, you're going to review the major tools of the Federal Reserve. They can be the discount rate, the reserve requirement, which are not really used in monetary policy, but the big one is open market operations. So when the Fed made the announcement last week that they were raising the Fed funds rate, and that's a rate that they target. It's not that they tell banks that you now charge this interest rate. What they do is they start to shrink that money supply, and they do that by going out to the open market. And imagine that I'm the Federal Reserve, and if I start selling you bonds on the market, I'm going to be asking for cash. So I'm taking some of that cash out of the economy so there's less money. And if there's less money, the price of money is going to go up, and that's the form of the interest rate. And that can trickle to mortgage rates. So mortgage rates are starting to go up too. So it's kind of like deterring that buying a little bit to make sure that the economy doesn't overheat. And also in this chapter, they're going to talk about quantitative easing too, because the Fed has a like $4.5 trillion balance sheet. And what they did is they went out and bought a whole bunch of long-term debt, and there's an inverse relationship with debt, that as the price goes up, the interest rate goes down, and the price goes down, the interest rate goes up. So what they were doing is they were buying a lot of long-term debt to keep the prices up in order to keep the long-term rates low. So the question is, do they need to start dumping some of that balance sheet, and that could be part of the quantitative easing or backing off quantitative easing. Okay, so you're going to read a few more things in that chapter too. One's with the MV equals PQ, with the quantity theory of money. That has some interesting theories behind that too. Last chapter, chapter 49, going to do with foreign exchange and how that's determined, basically the price of foreign exchange. If a country's currency is appreciating, that means that it's getting stronger and it's more valuable. If it's depreciating, that means it's becoming worth less. And it gave you a great example with the recent events with the Brexit. When the British voted to get out of the European Union, they saw the value of the British pound decline quite a bit. So we asked the question, is this good or bad? Is it good to have a strong British pound or a weak British pound? Well, it depends on which perspective you're looking at it. From an exporter's perspective from the British, that's actually a benefit, because now it's cheaper to buy British currency. So they're looking to make trade deals with the United States. But from an investment perspective, if you had owned stock and that was put into British pounds or a British company, and you try to convert that money back to US dollars, you're going to get less. So it just depends which side you're on. So But it's really supply and demand forces that determine that exchange rate. And if we're comparing, say, the United States to the British pound, if the British pound is getting weaker, that means that the US dollar has to be appreciating in value. So it works vice versa. In this chapter 2, they're also going to talk about purchasing power parity and a theory, the idea that if something is very expensive in one country, ideally what would happen is perhaps you'd want to export that item out. Let's say, for example, like cigarettes were really expensive in the United States, and somebody could import cigarettes from Canada that were much cheaper. Well, what would happen in the long run, in theory, is that there would be less supply of cigarettes in Canada that would push the prices up. As more cigarettes come to the United States, that would push the prices down. So in the law, purchasing power parity is that exchange rate should settle out to an equivalent exchange rate. But we know that's not always the case. Like if we exchange currencies, maybe I can go to Mexico and enjoy a better vacation compared to the United States. So not all goods and services are transferable, and we have different elasticities of demand and supply for those goods and services too. So that's why there's always going to be some discrepancies. But I would argue that the foreign exchange market is the biggest market in the world, and there's people constantly monitoring that market to look for any discrepancies. So in theory, it should get back to a point that somebody can't engage in arbitrage to at least make money off a trade consistently. So, all right, last thing I want to talk about is just some policies with that. With exchange rates, some countries decide to have fixed exchange rates. Some have more flexible. The textbook talks about kind of a soft and hard. And then some countries may actually peg their currency to like the US dollar. So the problem with doing sometimes with fixed and pegging is that it limits you on what your monetary policy can be, and that can have implications to try to stimulate and grow the economy. So, all right, that's an overview of this week. So, want you all to have a great week, and I'll talk to you online. Take care.